Late September in Bend has a particular stillness to it. The air is sharp, but not yet bitter, the kind that carries the faint scent of pine and the earthy musk of fallen leaves. I parked at the curb where my father used to keep his old pickup, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. Across the street, the Harper's maple tree was on fire with red and gold, its leaves drifting lazily to the pavement. I hadn't planned this trip. There were no suitcases in the back seat, no calls made ahead, just me, the car, and the sudden decision that I needed to see the house. Mom used to say, "Home should be the one place they can't shut you out of." Those words had always sounded comforting. Today, they felt like a dare. I stepped out, boots crunching on the gravel strip between the street and the sidewalk, and took in the sight of the white-gray siding my parents had painted themselves one summer. From here, it looked the same. But as I climbed the porch steps, I noticed the sheen of fresh varnish on the rail, the faint smell of new paint wafting from inside. My hand trailed along the wood as I reached the door and knocked. It opened only a few inches. Cassian filled the narrow space, leaning his shoulder against the frame like a barricade. His dark eyes scanned me from head to toe, not with curiosity, but with the cool assessment of someone measuring a problem. "What do you want? We're busy," he said, voice flat, but edged with irritation. "I'm here to see my sister," I answered, steady and measured. "This is still my home." He smirked, a flicker of amusement that didn't reach his eyes. A cool draft slipped through the gap, carrying with it the scent of fresh paint and something chemical, like new carpet glue. Behind him, I glimpsed the hallway where the family photo used to hang. It was gone. "This isn't a good time," he replied, pressing his shoulder more firmly into the door, as if my presence alone was a force to resist. I took in the way he stood, feet planted, one hand on the frame above his head. In American families, blocking the doorway isn't just bad manners, it's a statement. I control who comes in. I shifted my weight, but didn't step back. "It's funny," I said lightly. "I didn't realize I needed an appointment to walk into my own house." That earned me a narrowing of his eyes. And then, louder now, he said, "You're just a parasite here." The words shot out like a crack across still water, carrying past the porch. Mrs. Harper, halfway across her own steps with a broom, froze mid-sweep. A FedEx driver paused at his truck, head turning toward us. I felt the sting, sharp in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. My father's voice echoed in my mind. "Don't argue with a fool in public. They'll drag you down to their level." Lowering my voice so it wouldn't carry, I said, "You don't get to decide who belongs here." His lips curled, but he didn't move. My hand tightened on the porch railing, grounding me. I took a slow breath and let the heat in my chest settle into something steadier, an ember instead of a flare. I glanced past him again. New curtains where Mom's lace panels had been. A different rug in the entryway. A lock I didn't recognize on the side gate. None of these changes were accidental. They were statements. Stepping back, I scanned the porch, the yard, every detail that felt wrong. I wasn't leaving because he told me to. I was leaving because I needed to see the whole picture. People make mistakes when they think you're gone for good, and I had no intention of being gone. "I didn't come back to beg," I said quietly, meeting his gaze. "I came back to remind you whose foundation you're standing on." His smirk returned, slower this time, as if amused by the audacity. He leaned forward just enough for his cologne to mingle with the paint smell. "Leave now, or I'll make you." His words weren't just a threat, they were a declaration of war. I didn't move right away after his threat. Instead, I let the words hang there, letting him believe they'd landed harder than they actually had. I took one deliberate step back, not in retreat, but to give myself the vantage point to take in more than just his frame in the doorway. The boards under my boots gave a faint creak, the kind that told me they'd been replaced recently. The scent of fresh varnish mingled with something warmer, cinnamon. Malis had always lit cinnamon candles in the fall, but there was no sense of welcome in it now. Through the narrow opening Cassian allowed, I saw her for the first time since I'd arrived. She was behind him, not close enough to touch, arms crossed loosely over her chest. She didn't speak, didn't wave, didn't even tilt her head in acknowledgement. The air between them felt tight, as though they'd been in the middle of a conversation they didn't want me to hear. Are you going to let me in, or are we going to have this talk through a crack in the door? I asked, keeping my tone level. Cassian didn't answer right away. He shifted his weight, the edge of the door scraping faintly against the frame as he moved. It was only a sliver, but enough for me to glimpse the hallway. My eyes went straight to the wall opposite the entry, the one that had held the large framed photo of our parents and the two of us on the porch the summer before Dad passed. It was gone. In its place hung a glossy, oversaturated engagement portrait of Malus and Cassian, all coordinated outfits and staged smiles. The kind of picture that didn't just mark an event, it announced ownership. "Where's the family photo?" I asked, my voice calm but carrying a deliberate edge. From further inside, Malus finally spoke. It didn't fit the decor anymore. She didn't meet my eyes when she said it. You don't just swap out a family portrait like you do curtains. In any home, especially here, that picture was more than decoration. It was the story of who lived here and why the place mattered, and they'd rewritten that story without me. I felt something inside me lock into place. This wasn't just about being unwelcome for a day. This was about erasing me entirely. As I absorbed that, my gaze caught on something else, a medium-sized USPS box leaning against the hallway wall near the coat rack. My name and current address in Seattle were printed clearly on the label. I'd been waiting on a set of files from my attorney's office. If they'd been forwarded here by mistake, they could be critical. Cassian saw my eyes flick toward it and, with deliberate precision, stepped sideways until his body blocked it completely. That's mine, I said, pointing toward where the corner of the box still peeked from behind him. Not anymore, he replied without missing a beat. Anything sent here stays here unless Malus says otherwise. I looked past him to her. She was folding laundry on the arm of the couch, methodically, as if none of this was happening. She didn't object, didn't look apologetic, just kept smoothing sleeves and stacking neat piles. Are you listening to yourself? I asked, my eyes shifting between them. You're keeping mail that doesn't belong to you. You know that's a federal offense, right? Cassian shrugged, the kind of shrug people give when they think consequences don't apply to them. Then maybe the mail should have gone where you actually live. The audacity wasn't surprising, but the casualness of it was. He didn't even pretend to be concerned that I might follow through on the warning. I drew in a breath and let it out slowly. Have you made a lot of changes to the house? I asked, the question more a probe than a conversation starter. Just improvements, he said vaguely, eyes fixed on me like he was daring me to challenge the word. Malus's gaze stayed down, folding a dish towel into a perfect square. She didn't answer, but the silence told me more than any words could. You can repaint walls, you can swap rugs and furniture, but you don't remove the markers of who belongs here, unless that's exactly what you're trying to do. The hallway felt colder than the air outside, and I knew if I pressed further now, they'd only dig in deeper. I forced my shoulders to relax and stepped back onto the porch, as if conceding the moment. Cassian's mouth curled into a faint grin, the kind that wasn't about humor but about satisfaction. Without a word, he began to close the door. My eyes locked on the blurred shape of that box through the narrowing gap. As the latch clicked into place, I knew this wasn't about hospitality. It was about removing me from the picture altogether. I stayed on the porch longer than I should have, the cool air wrapping around me while the door remained firmly shut. Through the narrow glass panel beside it, Malus's face appeared for a moment. Her eyes found mine, but there was nothing in them. No flicker of apology, no question, no protest to Cassian's behavior. Just stillness. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. Permission. She didn't need to say, I agree with him. She'd said it with the way she didn't reach for the door handle, the way she didn't call my name. That truth sat heavy, more than the sting of Cassian's insult. I thought of something my mother told me once when she was disappointed in a friend. Silence is agreement when you know you should speak. Inside, Malus went back to folding laundry on the couch. I could see her through the glass, lifting shirts, smoothing sleeves, stacking them in neat piles. It was a domestic picture, but stripped of warmth. Even the rhythm of her hands felt deliberate, like keeping busy would make me disappear from her periphery. I realized then that I could no longer mistake her passivity for neutrality. She'd chosen her side, and it wasn't mine. The distance between us in that moment felt wider than the years I'd been away, and if I wanted anything to change, I couldn't wait for her to find her voice. I would have to be my own advocate. I turned from the porch, the boards creaking under my boots as I headed toward the driveway. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves and motor oil, the familiar sense of this house mingling with something else, an undertone of neglect. I cut across the side yard toward my car, passing by the garage. That's when I noticed the trash bin lid was ajar. It wasn't unusual for it to be open a crack, but something about the way it gaped caught my attention. I stepped closer, lifting the lid with one hand. Inside, among cardboard packaging, crumpled grocery bags, and broken bits of ceramic, lay something that made my breath catch. My father's pocket watch. It was still recognizable despite the new scratches along the case. The brass had dulled to a muted gold, and the chain was tangled in a wad of used paper towels. My hand went in before I even thought about it, pushing aside the debris until I could free it. They didn't even try to hide it, I murmured to myself. The weight of it in my palm was more than just metal, it was history. I remembered the day he gave it to me, how he'd pressed it into my hand with the words, "It's not about keeping time, it's about remembering who you are." The watch had been his since he was 18, a graduation gift from his father. And now it was here, tossed in with yesterday's trash like it meant nothing. In American families, you don't throw away heirlooms without consent, not unless you're making a point. This wasn't cleaning out clutter. This was a silent declaration. This isn't yours anymore. I brushed off the dust and bits of paper, my thumb tracing the shallow dent on the back where it had once been dropped on the porch steps during a 4th of July party. The memory was vivid, Dad laughing, Mom rolling her eyes, Malis running over to check if it still worked. We had all cared about it once. Now, I was apparently the only one left who did. I stood there, watching the sunlight glance off the scratched surface, and felt the sting of betrayal settle deeper. Not just for the watch, but for what it symbolized. They weren't just changing the house, they were stripping away the pieces of me that lived here. I slipped the watch into my coat pocket, the cool metal pressing against my palm. Confronting them now would be useless. They'd deny intent, call it an accident, maybe even laugh it off. Better to hold on to it quietly, as proof. As I lowered the trash lid, I caught the sound of a voice from inside the garage. Cassian's, low and casual, but carrying clearly enough through the open side door. "We'll have it ready to list by next month," he said. The words landed like a stone in water, rippling out with implications I couldn't ignore. That one overheard sentence told me everything I needed to know, and more than they ever wanted me to find out. Cassian's voice from the garage still rang in my ears as I stepped toward the driveway, trying to look like I was on my way out. My boots scuffed lightly against the cracked concrete, and I let my pace slow as I neared the hedge that divided the property from Vionel's yard. She was there, bent slightly at the waist, watering her chrysanthemums, their purple blooms stubbornly holding on against the chill in the air. When she looked up, she didn't call out. Instead, she gave me a subtle nod, just enough to let me know she'd heard, maybe even seen, more than she'd admit out loud. Her gaze flicked briefly toward the garage, then back to her flowers, as if nothing had passed between us. But that was the thing about people who knew the truth. They didn't always need words. I'd learned that lesson years ago from a mentor at work. People who know the truth will show it in the smallest gestures, he'd told me. And here was Vionel, playing her part without drawing attention. I stored that away like a file in a locked drawer. If I needed someone to verify what I'd heard, or what I would inevitably uncover, she might be the one to do it. I gave her a small wave, just enough to keep Cassian from suspecting anything if he happened to be looking, and cut back toward the side of the house. The mudroom door was unlocked, so I eased it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, a blend of laundry detergent, faint mildew, and the lingering tang of cold air sneaking in from somewhere. This was the part of the house that had always been transitional, a space where muddy boots and grocery bags landed before making their way into the kitchen. Against the far wall stood the old oak cabinet. My mother had used it for decades to store the things she didn't trust to cardboard boxes, family photo albums, her recipe box with stained index cards, our graduation programs, even the letters Dad wrote her during his first job out of state. It was the kind of piece that was as much a vault as it was furniture. Now, it had a padlock, a shiny, brand-new padlock that hadn't been there before. I stepped closer, running my fingers lightly along the grain of the wood, remembering the countless times I'd opened those doors without a thought. The cool metal of the lock was jarring in contrast. Footsteps padded behind me, and I turned to find Malis in the doorway to the kitchen, her hands empty for once. "Why is this locked?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She glanced at the cabinet, then at me, but not for long. Her eyes slid away toward the floor. "Cassian said it's safer this way." "Safer from what?" I pressed. She shifted her weight. "Just safer." And with that, she moved past me toward the laundry area, as if the conversation were already over. It wasn't about safety. It was about access. In any household, locking away shared family memories wasn't about protection. It was about deciding who gets to hold the narrative. For a moment, my hand tightened on the cabinet handle, a part of me tempted to see if the wood would give under enough force, but I knew better. Breaking it open now would hand Cassian exactly the ammunition he'd want, a story about me being reckless, destructive, unstable. So I stepped back. Not yet. I let my eyes wander over the rest of the mudroom, taking in the subtle shifts, coats that weren't ours, boots in sizes no one in the family wore. Even the doormat was different, replaced with one that said, "Welcome friends." I wondered if they'd laughed when they picked it out. You can lock a cabinet, I thought, but you can't lock away what I remember. The images, the smells, the sounds, they were mine to keep, no matter what they tried to erase. I turned toward the door, ready to leave before my resolve cracked. That's when I heard it, footsteps approaching from the garage, heavy and deliberate. Cassian's voice followed, each word sharp enough to cut. "What are you doing in here?" The question wasn't innocent, it was an accusation, and it was only the start. Cassian's question from the mudroom still hung in the air, but I gave him nothing. No excuse, no explanation, just a deliberate step past him, out into the driveway, as if my being there had been incidental. The afternoon light had shifted, pulling longer shadows across the cracked pavement. I pretended to check something in my car, my hands fishing absently through the glove box, while my ears stayed tuned to the side of the house. The side door opened with a muted creak. Malis stepped out, eyes locked on the ground, clutching her phone in both hands. The posture was telling, shoulders slightly hunched, as if she were bracing for something. She didn't look at me. I shut the glove box softly and leaned against the driver's side door. The air between us was thick with things unsaid, but the silence broke when Cassian's voice carried from the open garage door. "If we can list it by mid-October," he said, his tone all business, "we'll have offers before the holidays." I stilled, my eyes flicking toward the sound. Malis's reply was quieter but still clear enough. "We just have to keep her from showing up again. She has no idea what's coming." There it was, said out loud, without shame. The casualness in their voices made my skin prickle. This wasn't a heated argument, not an impulsive threat. It was a plan. A calm, coordinated plan to sell the house our parents left us, without my consent. My jaw tightened, but I forced my expression into something unreadable. In Oregon, as in most of the country, co-ownership meant both signatures were required for a sale. I had every legal right to stop them, and they were either banking on me not knowing that or hoping to push me out before I could act. Either way, they'd just handed me a weapon. I stepped forward, closing the gap toward the garage so they couldn't pretend I hadn't heard. "Planning a sale?" My voice was even, but it cut through the air like a blade. "You'll need my permission for that." Cassian turned, his mouth curving into that infuriating half-smile he wore whenever he thought he had the upper hand. But before he could speak, Malis lifted her eyes to mine. "You had your chance to be part of this family," she said, her tone stripped of warmth. "You blew it." It landed harder than I expected, not because I believed it, but because she said it so easily. No hesitation, no flicker of doubt. In that moment, she didn't just stand beside Cassian, she stood firmly on his side of the line. I let the words sit between us. "Is that really how you see it?" Her gaze didn't waver. It's how it is. A muscle ticked in my jaw, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of watching me unravel. I could have thrown back a dozen truths about who kept the family afloat when she was in school, about who paid for the repairs after the winter storm. But I knew better. People this convinced of their own narrative don't hear you. They just dig in deeper. So I pivoted. Good to know, I said lightly, almost dismissively, as if her statement had been a weather report instead of an indictment. I'll keep that in mind. I walked back toward my car without hurry, sliding into the driver's seat as though I had all the time in the world. Inside, my mind was already ticking through next steps. Which lawyer to call, what documents to pull, who might have copies of the will besides me. If they thought I was going to slink away quietly, they hadn't been paying attention to the woman they were trying to erase. As I eased the car down the driveway, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror. Cassian stood next to Malis, his hand on her shoulder, wearing a smirk that reeked of premature victory. They didn't know it yet, but they'd just given me the motive, and soon I'd have the proof. Cassian's smirk lingered in my mind long after I'd pulled away from the driveway. Malis's flat dismissal had been one thing, expected, almost rehearsed, but his expression carried the smug certainty of a man who thought the game was already won. I drove through downtown Bend until I found a small coffee shop tucked between an antique bookstore and a florist. It was the kind of place where the hiss of the espresso machine covered any quiet conversation, and the smell of roasted beans seemed to sharpen my thoughts. I slid into a corner booth, pulled my laptop from my bag, and took a slow sip of coffee before opening the lid. They think my silence is surrender, I thought. It's the same mistake people make before they lose. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a memory surfaced. My mother explaining that she kept copies of important things in a cloud folder, just in case something happened to the originals. She'd been a meticulous record keeper, the kind of woman who believed in insurance policies and backup plans. I logged into the account. My heart picked up as the familiar directory opened, the folder labeled simply Home. Inside, nested between subfolders for recipes and family photos, was one titled Estate. I clicked. There it was, a scanned PDF of the original will. My eyes moved quickly but carefully, tracing the typed lines. Both our names were listed as equal beneficiaries. The language was explicit. The property shall not be sold, transferred, or encumbered without the mutual consent of both parties. I leaned back against the booth, the weight of relief and fury pressing down in equal measure. Relief, because here was tangible proof, undeniable, legally binding. Fury, because they'd been speaking about selling the house as if this document didn't exist. In the U.S., estate law is unambiguous on clauses like this. Unless both owners agree, a sale is off the table. They either didn't know that, or worse, they knew and were counting on me not to. I downloaded the file to my laptop and an encrypted flash drive, then forwarded a copy to my personal email and my attorney's old address. I wasn't making the mistake of having just one copy of anything ever again. By the time I left the coffee shop, the low gray clouds had thickened. I drove back toward the house, telling myself I was only going to retrieve my mail. In truth, I wanted to see if I could catch them in another lie. As I stepped onto the porch, Cassian appeared almost instantly, as if he'd been watching from a window. "You need to leave," he said, voice clipped. "Right now, or I'm calling the police for trespassing." I met his stare without blinking. "You can't trespass on a house you own," I said evenly. "And I own half of this one." For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Hesitation, maybe even surprise. He hadn't expected me to be so certain, so quick with the words. "We'll see what the sheriff has to say about that," he muttered. "You do that," I replied, my tone calm enough to make him flinch. "And be sure to show him the deed while you're at it." The corner of his jaw tightened. He opened his mouth like he might argue further, but instead, he stepped back and let the screen door close between us. Inside, I could hear muted voices, his, Malis's, though the words blurred into a low hum. I stayed only long enough to collect the envelopes in the box, flipping through them to confirm what I already suspected. At least one piece of mail had been withheld. I walked back to my car without another word. The urge to confront them then and there was strong, but I wanted control. Of my words, of the narrative, of the next move. They can lock cabinets, throw away keepsakes, and threaten me at the door, I thought as I started the engine. But the will changes everything. That night at my kitchen table, I spread out the printed copy of the document beside my laptop, reading every line again. The language was airtight. Even the most aggressive attorney would have trouble twisting it in their favor. As I was closing the file, my email pinged. A property search alert, the kind I'd set up months ago, just out of curiosity, flashed across the screen. There it was in black and white. Pending sale listed next to my parents' address. If they were willing to go that far, then I was done playing defense. The pending sale notice burned in my mind all night, its implications replaying in a loop that made sleep impossible. By morning, I'd decided I wasn't going to dance around it. I called Malis directly, ready to hear what excuse she'd come up with. Cassian answered. "Malis can't talk right now," he said, his tone wrapped in false politeness, but with a thread of hostility so taut it was almost audible. "We'll discuss it when appropriate." "When appropriate for who?" I asked, keeping my voice low but firm. There was a pause, just long enough for me to picture the smug look on his face, before he said, "For everyone involved," and hung up. That was enough to get me in the car. I drove to the house, my hands steady on the wheel, my thoughts already arranging themselves into lines I intended to deliver without flinching. Malis was in the front yard when I pulled up, clipping the last of the season's hydrangeas. She froze when she saw me, the shears held awkwardly in midair. "We need to talk," I said, stepping onto the walkway. Before she could respond, the garage door creaked open and Cassian emerged. He moved toward us with that same calculated speed I'd seen before, placing himself between us so completely that I couldn't even see her shoes behind his frame. "Malis, I'm talking to you, not him," I said, shifting slightly to catch her eyes. "Anything you say to her, you can say to me," Cassian interjected, his voice loud enough to drown out whatever Malis might have managed. I took a slow breath, the kind you learn to take when someone's trying to provoke you. "That's convenient," I said evenly. "For you." He didn't move. The sheer physicality of his blocking told me more than his words. He wasn't going to let her speak to me without him filtering it. In family disputes, that's a tactic older than courtrooms. Cut off private dialogue, and you control the narrative. I stepped back a pace, not out of retreat, but to give myself space to look him over. "So the sale," I said, letting the word hang. Cassian's mouth curved into that infuriating smirk. "If you keep harassing us, I'll file for a restraining order, trespassing, harassment, the whole package. You step on this property again without permission, I'll have the paperwork ready." I let the pause stretch just long enough to feel heavy between us. "Then you'd better make sure the paperwork mentions my name on the deed," I said, my tone as even as if I were ordering a cup of coffee. The smirk faltered. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell me the reminder of my co-ownership had slipped past his armor. "See, this isn't personal," he tried, straightening his shoulders. "It's not personal until you make it about erasing me," I replied. His jaw worked, and for a moment I thought he might actually step aside. Instead, he turned his head toward the garage, signaling Malis to go inside. She obeyed without a word. I didn't give him anything else. No raised voice, no outburst he could twist later. I walked back to my car, my heels crunching over the gravel like punctuation marks to an unspoken sentence. They can block my words, but they can't block what I can prove. As I reached the driver's side, I caught it. Cassian's voice, lower now, aimed at Malis somewhere just inside the garage. "She won't see the next hit coming." He was right about one thing. I didn't see it coming, but he didn't see mine either. Cassian's words, "she won't see the next hit coming," were still humming in my head as I turned the corner at the end of their street. I didn't go far. Just far enough to park out of sight, cut the engine, and let the adrenaline taper down. The temptation to storm back in was sharp, but my father's voice cut through. "When you're cornered, gather proof, not bruises." I sat there for a while, the hum of passing cars and the faint scent of pine resin filling the cabin. When my pulse finally evened out, I headed home with a single thought circling: proof first, action second. That evening, while sorting through my growing pile of notes and scanned documents, my phone lit up with a call from Helen, an old family friend who still played bridge with Malis once in a while. We exchanged a few pleasantries before her voice dipped. "I think you should see this," she said. Seconds later, my phone buzzed again, this time with a forwarded screenshot. It was a text from Cassian to Melis, but the top of the image showed it had been sent to Helen by mistake. "We need her out before next week. The date stamp was yesterday, a tight deadline." My jaw locked. This wasn't vague scheming anymore, it was a countdown. I stared at the words until they stopped feeling like language and started feeling like a fuse. No more guesswork, no more wondering how far they'd go. They were telling each other, in writing, exactly what I already knew in my bones. Cold focus took over. I filed the screenshot alongside the will and my property records. If they wanted to race the clock, I'd make sure they tripped before the finish line. Later that night, a different memory surfaced, one from the attic. Years ago, after Mom's funeral, I'd seen the framed photo of the four of us taken the summer before Dad got sick. On the back, in Mom's looping script and Dad's blocky print, they'd written, "For our girls to always have a home." I grabbed a flashlight and drove back to the neighborhood. The sky was low and dark, the kind of night where porch lights looked like lonely stars. Parking a few houses down, I cut across the side yard and craned my neck toward the attic window. Through a sliver where the curtain didn't quite meet, I saw it, leaning against a wall, the gold frame catching the faintest glint from the streetlight. My stomach knotted. They hadn't tossed it out, not yet, but it was hidden, like the sentiment on the back was too dangerous to leave in plain sight. That frame wasn't just nostalgia, it was intent in physical form. My parents had put it in writing, in ink meant to last. And there it was, quietly contradicting everything Cassian and Melis were pretending was true. I stepped back into the shadows, letting the flashlight click off in my palm. The commitment in me deepened. This wouldn't just be about stopping them, it would be about showing everyone exactly what they were trying to bury. Before leaving, I circled toward the home office window. The blinds were drawn but not tight. Through the narrow gaps, I could see papers spread across the desk. I zoomed my phone's camera and snapped several shots, adjusting until the text came into focus. It was the sale contract. My name was printed under seller, but the signature line beneath it was blank. Without that signature, the deal was dead on arrival. The legal leverage was right there in black and white. I took extra shots, making sure the date, property address, and blank line were all in frame. By the time I was back in my car, my hands had stopped shaking. I drove home without turning on the radio, my mind working in clean, deliberate lines. At the kitchen table, I laid it all out. The text from Helen, the mental image of that attic photo, the contract photos, and the will. Piece by piece, the picture was becoming impossible to ignore. They wanted me erased, I murmured to myself, sliding each file into a folder on my laptop labeled Case Evidence. I'll make sure they're remembered for what they tried to do. As I was labeling the files, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from Melis. The subject line was simple: family discussion. Inside was a time, a date, and the address I knew all too well, an invitation to come to the house tomorrow. They thought it would be their stage. They didn't know I was bringing my own spotlight. The meeting invite from Melis was still open on my phone when I dialed Vianel's number that night. She picked up after the second ring, her voice low but steady. "I had a feeling you'd be calling," she said. "I think you know more than you've told me," I replied. "And I think I need it before tomorrow." There was a pause long enough to make me wonder if she'd refuse. Then she said, "Come by in the morning, early, before they're awake." At 7:15 the next day, I was at her kitchen table, the smell of strong coffee and cinnamon toast drifting between us. She slid a thick manila envelope across the table without preamble. "I figured you'd need this when the time came," she said. "Looks like the time's now." I pulled the flap open and began to sift through the contents. The first sheet was a glossy flyer from a real estate agency, a full-color photo of my parents' house plastered across the top with the words, "Coming soon." My chest tightened as I moved to the next page, a preliminary sale packet, the kind agents prepare before the listing goes live, square footage, property details, suggested asking price. Behind that were handwritten notes on lined paper. The penmanship was unfamiliar, but the words were unmistakable, bullet points of phrases I'd heard from Cassian before, only now recorded in black ink. List by mid-October. Don't mention co-owner to buyers. I looked up at Vianelle. You wrote these? I overheard him on the phone in the garage, she said. Figured he wouldn't be careful around me. People like him never are. I set the papers down carefully, the gratitude and resolve mixing in my voice. This isn't just helpful, it's exactly what I needed. You're not fighting alone, she said simply, and I believed her. By 9, I was sitting in the familiar leather chair across from Torrin Vexley's desk. He scanned each document in silence, pausing longest on the unsigned sale contract I'd photographed through the office window and the clause in the will that locked the property from any unilateral sale. When he finally spoke, his words were deliberate. They can't legally move forward without your signature. If they try, it's fraud. And with this, he tapped the handwritten notes, you've got evidence of intent. I felt the knot in my chest loosen. Then let's make sure they try. In front of witnesses. Torrin leaned back, a small smile tugging at his mouth. You've got leverage, Arindra, the kind that doesn't just stop them, it puts them on the defensive. I left his office with the kind of clarity that had been missing for weeks. The folder in my bag now contained the will, the contract photos, the text screenshot Helen had sent me, a printed copy of the photo my parents had signed, and Vianelle's notes. Every piece fit together like a lock I finally had the key for. In the car, I flipped the folder closed and rested my hand on it. If they wanted a performance, I'd give them one they'd never forget. I was halfway home when my phone buzzed with a new text. The number wasn't in my contacts. Hope you're ready to lose. I stared at it for a long second before a slow, steady heat began to build in my chest. I was ready, but not in the way they thought. The text from the unknown number sat on my screen like a dare. Hope you're ready to lose. I stared at it for a moment, then set my phone face down on the passenger seat. The only answer I needed to give would be in person. By the time I turned onto the street for the family discussion, my mind was clear. I parked deliberately in full view of the front window, the car angled just so they couldn't miss it. This wasn't a sneaky visit. I wanted them to see me arrive on my own terms. When I stepped through the door, folder in hand, the living room was staged like a negotiation scene from a movie. Malis sat with her legs crossed, coffee mug in hand, eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond me. Cassian leaned back in the armchair opposite her, posture loose but eyes sharp. Thanks for coming, Cassian said, as though he were hosting a polite brunch. We need to talk about your recent interference. I didn't sit. I let him go on, outlining his concerns in that oily tone people use when they think they're giving you a fair hearing. He painted himself as the responsible steward, me as the unstable sibling jeopardizing the home's future. When he finally paused, I walked to the coffee table and placed the original will right in the center. The paper made a soft thump against the wood. Shall we read this together? I said, my voice even. Out loud, so there's no confusion. The shift in the room was instant. Malis's gaze flickered toward Cassian, then down at her mug. Cassian's jaw tightened, but he didn't reach for the document. He tried to steer the conversation back to family harmony, but I wasn't interested. I slid another sheet from my folder, this time the photograph of the unsigned sale contract. This signature line? I tapped it with one finger. Mine, blank, which means the sale is invalid. Color crept into Malis's cheeks. Cassian's voice rose, accusing me of spying, of invading his privacy. If you didn't want me to see it, I said calmly, you shouldn't have left it on the desk in plain sight. It wasn't anger I heard in his voice after that, it was deflection, the sound of someone cornered, scrabbling for a way to make the problem about the other person. That was when the front door opened and Torrin stepped in, a slim leather briefcase in hand. His presence seemed to pull the air out of the room. I'm here as Ms. Kelm's legal counsel, he said without ceremony. He took a seat at the end of the coffee table, opened the will, and read a few lines aloud before turning to Cassian. You're not even on the deed. Legally, you have zero standing here. The words landed like a hammer. Cassian's smirk faltered for the first time in weeks. Malis looked from him to me, and I could see the realization settling in. Whatever story he'd been telling her didn't match the one written into law in U.S. Property disputes. A bluff only works as long as no one calls it. I had just called it, in front of the one person whose opinion could end the whole charade. I gathered my documents slowly, deliberately, standing tall as I slid them back into the folder. You wanted to strip me of my place, I said. Instead, you handed me the stage. Cassian muttered something under his breath as I headed for the door. I caught just enough. This isn't over. For once, he was right. But now the ending would be mine to write. Cassian's parting words, "This isn't over," were still ringing in my ears when my phone buzzed the next morning. It was Torin. The judge signed off on a temporary injunction, he said without preamble. The sale is frozen, and your legal right to access the property is affirmed until this is resolved. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the words settle. No more locked doors, no more being kept out of what was mine. I drove to the house without the knot of tension I'd carried on every visit before. The keys felt solid in my hand when I stepped onto the porch, the same boards where Cassian had once blocked me like a bouncer. This time, I turned the lock myself and pushed the door open without hesitation. The air inside was warm, tinged with the smell of coffee. Cassian was nowhere in sight. Malis stood in the kitchen, her hands resting on the counter, pale and unmoving. You can keep the coffee pot running, I said as I stepped inside, my voice steady. But you can't keep me out anymore. She didn't answer. The silence wasn't the same as before. It wasn't complicit. It was resigned. I walked through the room slowly, taking in the changes they'd made. New curtains, a different rug, the rearranged furniture. Some of it could stay, some of it would go. But this wasn't about erasing their presence. It was about restoring mine. Taking back space isn't about the walls, I thought. It's about the message that you belong here. In the living room, I moved a chair back to the spot where Dad used to sit on Sunday mornings. I set a small framed picture of him on the side table, the kind of detail you can't miss even if you try not to look. In the dining room, I pulled out one of Mom's old serving bowls from the cabinet and placed it in the center of the table. Not decoration, declaration. As I passed back through the kitchen, Malis was still there. She watched me now, her eyes cautious. Any future decisions about this house, I said evenly, will be discussed with me present. She opened her mouth, closed it, then nodded once. I'm not here to erase you, I added. But I won't let you erase me again. The tone was calm, but I made sure the boundary was carved deep enough to last. By late evening, I was ready to leave. I locked the door behind me, the satisfying click echoing in the quiet street. As I turned toward my car, I noticed an unfamiliar sedan idling across the road. The driver's face was shadowed, unreadable. I didn't know if it was curiosity or a warning, but I was ready for either. The unfamiliar car was gone by morning, but the image of it idling across the street stayed with me. Whether it had been Cassian's last bluff or someone testing the waters, I refused to let it dictate my next move. I walked into the house with deliberate calm, every step a signal that I wasn't a guest. I was an owner. By mid-morning, the rumble of a diesel engine filled the driveway. I stepped to the front window and saw the moving truck, the company logo half faded on the side. Cassian was on the porch, hauling a box so tightly his knuckles were white. His eyes met mine briefly, flat, unreadable, and then he looked away. I opened the door and stood in the frame, letting him see I wasn't hiding. Make sure you take everything that's yours, I said, my voice even but edged with steel. That way, there's no reason for you to come back. He didn't respond, just shifted the box in his grip and kept walking toward the truck. Malis was at the far end of the porch, a light sweater wrapped around her despite the mild weather. She didn't look at me. Her gaze was fixed somewhere past the hedges. The silence between them was louder than any argument. Whatever unity they'd tried to project had cracked. I watched in stillness as each load went from porch to truck, the sound of shifting cardboard and scuffed shoes punctuating the morning air. No shouting, no last-minute negotiations, just the quiet closure I'd been envisioning since the first time Cassian stood in this doorway and blocked my path. By noon, the truck door slammed shut, the hydraulic lift whining as it locked in place. Cassian gave one last glance toward the house, then climbed into the passenger seat. The engine roared, and just like that, he was gone. That afternoon, a knock came at the front door. When I opened it, Fiancé stood there holding a loaf of bread wrapped in a clean kitchen towel. "I told you," she said with a small smile, "you'd come back stronger." I stepped aside to let her in. "Stronger," I agreed, "and smarter." She set the bread on the counter and glanced around the kitchen. "Looks more like yours already," she said. "It's getting there," I replied. The win in court was one thing, but this, I gestured toward the rooms beyond, this is the real victory, keeping my place in the story. Fiancé stayed for coffee, her presence as steadying as the quiet hum of the refrigerator. When she left, she squeezed my hand once before stepping out into the late afternoon sun. That evening, I went to the closet where I'd stored the frame. The family photo was just as I remembered, Dad's hand resting on Mom's shoulder, Malis and me on either side. On the back, in the handwriting I'd know anywhere, for our girls to always have a home. I hung it back in the living room, in the exact spot where Cassian had replaced it with his engagement photo. The wall seemed right again, like it had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Some things belong where they started, especially when they were built on love. As night settled over the house, I locked the front door and felt the weight of the place settle in my hands. It was mine again, in law and in spirit. They tried to erase me. All they did was write my name in bolder ink. I settled into my armchair, the one by the front window. The room was quiet, but my phone buzzed against the table. "You'll want to see this." I looked at the message for a long beat, the corners of my mouth lifting slightly. I thought the battle was over. Maybe it was just the first war I'd won.